Datang and Vitamir, do I say it right in Polish, to the webinar, Kuala Lumpur and Warsaw, the tale of two contrasting cities. Depending on your location, of course, I would like to wish all of you a very good morning and good afternoon here in Malaysia to everyone here. Yeah, my name is Shireen and I'm from UPM, University Putra Malaysia, and I will be the moderator for this webinar. And I would also like to welcome our honorable guest, the representative for Ambassador of the Republic of Poland in Malaysia, for His Excellency Krzysztof Debnitsky, which is Joanna. Welcome, Joanna. And Ambassador of Malaysia in Poland, Excellency Chitra Devi Ramla. And also joining us today, Dr. Jaroslaw Szuchopres, former Ambassador of Poland in Finland. And then as all of you has read from the poster, this seminar is part of the program in celebrating 50 years of diplomatic relations between Malaysia and the Republic of Poland. Since 1971, both Malaysia and Poland are working closely to promote common interests in various platforms such as trade and investment, cultural exchanges, tourism, and education, among others. To further enhance the collaboration in the area of research and education, we are very excited that this seminar has finally materialized. The sharing session today is jointly organized by the Faculty of Design and Architecture in collaboration with the Master of Urban Tropical Program in the Faculty of Design and Architecture. And also this seminar is also jointly organized with the University of Warsaw. Thank you very much for the collaboration. And as an introduction, in a few moments, we will have a welcoming address by the ambassadors, also followed by our Dean, Dr. Sohardi. And shortly after that, our session will start with 5 experts in their fields, sharing with us topic in relations to urbanism in Warsaw and Kuala Lumpur. The 5 speakers are Mariana Isa from e-commerce Malaysia. We have Professor Hubert Kowalski and Monica Dunaico from the University of Warsaw, Dr. Katarzyna Wagner from the University of Warsaw, and our colleague, Dr. Mari Kozlowski from UPM. And we have informed that each speaker will have about 20 minutes. And after the last presentation by Dr. Mari, we will open the session for a Q&A. And in the meantime, you can also post your questions in the chat section and I will relay it to the respective speakers. Following that, we will hear a closing remarks by the former ambassador of Poland in Finland, Dr. Jaroslaw Szuchopres. With that, I would like to invite Madam Joanna, representing His Excellency Krzysztof Debnitsky, the ambassador of the Republic of Poland, to give a welcoming speech. I pass the screen to you, Joanna, now.
Thank you. Good afternoon here in Kuala Lumpur. Good morning for those joining in Poland. I'm Joy Urtyga, and I'm the Cultural Affairs and Public Diplomacy Officer at the Embassy of Poland. Unfortunately, His Excellency Ambassador Krzysztof Debnitsky is unable to join us this afternoon due to his pre-flight arrangements. However, he conveys his apologies and would like to say thank you to the organizers, Dr. Mari Kozlowski from University Putra Malaysia, and to Dr. Katarzyna Wagner from the University of Warsaw for organizing this seminar. We know that both of them, Dr. Kozlowski and Dr. Wagner, are working on a book together on urban development of Warsaw, which we are very much looking forward to its publishing, as it is going to be the first publication about Warsaw in Bahasa, Malaysia. So that's something which is quite thrilling, and we're looking forward to it. Welcome, my cat. I'm a kucing mama. You can see we are sort of actually been working from the office, not from home, but because it's afternoon here, I sort of rushed home to could follow the seminar to the end. And on a personal note, I'm actually thrilled to see Ms. Mariana is on a panelist, as we have met at the Malaysia at the Museum of Kuala Lumpur.
Yes.
Kuala Lumpur,
Museum
and
volunteers.
I have my favorite book on Kuala Lumpur's well-researched guide to the street names of Kuala Lumpur. Highly recommend if you haven't read it yet. Great read. Well-researched. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
So thank you all the panelists. Thank you for joining this seminar, and I am personally looking forward to the tale of the two cities, simply because I'm not from Warsaw. I'm from south of Poland, but I've been privileged to see the development of Kuala Lumpur the last 3 decades that I've been living here. So I'm actually looking forward to this incredible comparison of the two cities. So thank you once again. Dziękuję bardzo, terima kasih banyak, and greetings again from Kuala Lumpur. All the best. Good luck. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Or should I say dziękuję?
Dziękuję również.
All right, next, with great honor, I would like to invite Her Excellency, Madam Chitra Devi Ramla, the Ambassador of Malaysia in Poland, to deliver her welcoming speech. Dipersilakan.
Thank you, Dr. Serene. A very good afternoon and salam sejahtera. A good morning to those who are in this part of the world, in Warsaw University, those representing from Poland. Firstly, thank you so much to all the professors, doctors, ambassadors, all dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen who are joining this session, because it's a great honor for Malaysia and Poland commemorating the 50th anniversary. We've come a long journey of 50 years in Malaysia and with Poland. We are both in very strategic location, Malaysia in the hub and the center of Southeast Asia, ASEAN, the role that we play in many international forums. And here for Poland, they are in a very important position among the countries here. They are one of the high performance when it comes to economic performance. Even during the lockdown, they have done very well. And trade has grown in many folds between Malaysia and Poland. Many countries are suffering, but we have done so well. The opportunities are so vast, and the 50 years of journey has proved that. And we have another 50 years to look forward to vision what we could achieve. When you started, Dr. Surin, you was mentioning that we are looking at R&D. And this is the time when Poland is doing so well here. It's time for us to collaborate and look into new potentials. We had many plans actually to commemorate the 50th anniversary in a grand manner, but nobody expected the pandemic would come and put a lockdown last year, and this year it's going on. And I must say proudly that we're all quite safe in Poland, because almost 25 million people have been vaccinated with the second dose, and they are targeting by end of July. And in the case of Malaysia, we are also trying to do this by the end of December this year, to get as many people vaccinated and to open the international doors for everyone to travel and to have more people coming and meeting in person in Malaysia and in Poland. So with this, I hope the R&D research between both universities would be taken to a different extent, to a different platforms, to have greater collaborations. And talking about architecture and urban design, I must say that Poland has achieved a different level when it comes to the SDGs 2030. All buildings very elegant, yet very it comes with high performance and low energy consumptions and low cost of operations, which I think in Malaysia could collaborate to see how we could benefit out of learning from Poland, the good practices of Poland. I think Malaysia is also in the right direction for green buildings and green technology. We are already there, but Poland is very advanced here. In almost every sector, they have the green technology incorporated into it. And we have the beautiful Islamic designs of building, which I think the Polish would like to come and see and learn from us. I get a lot of requests from the local people wanting to travel, even during this pandemic time. but we have to tell them to be patient, wait for the right time to travel. I hope by the end of this year, we could facilitate more people to visit Malaysia and also to encourage the high-level visits to start back again. For the past 1.5 years, we've not got any visits at high level, which we started off very well. The number of tourists arriving in Malaysia was very, very encouraging in the first 2 months of last year. A very huge number traveled in the first 2 months, 8,000 almost tourist arrival to Malaysia. Comparative to the previous year in 2019, the total number of tourist arrival was only 20,000. So it was very promising in 2020, but unfortunately, pandemic tested all of us. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. I know there are many important speakers after this. We hope to have more sessions like this with Malaysia and Poland. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Ambassador Chitra, I never met you before, but I love your energy.
Is it? Thank you so much. I welcome you to visit us here. I'm really looking forward because we got more than 180 Malaysian students here and some students from Poland going to Malaysia, and the number is increasing every year. So this area of architecture and urban design is something that we have to come together. And this is your faculty, I believe, and I'm here to facilitate all of you. I'm here already 3.5 years. I have another 1 year, most probably. Anytime, please contact me for anything to do with Malaysia or Poland. I'm more than happy to facilitate. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. All right. With that, I would like to invite to give the last address, our Associate Professor Landscape Architect, Dr. Suhardi Maulan, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Design and Architecture. Dipersilakan, Dr. Suhardi.
Thank you, Dr. Shurin, for the invitation. Assalamualaikum and warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and very good afternoon. Distinguished guests, Your Excellency Ambassador Chitra Devi Ramya, Ambassador of Malaysia to Poland, Ms. Joanna, representative of Your Excellency Poland Ambassador to Malaysia, Ambassador Krzysztof Dimiski, Your Excellency Ambassador of Poland to Finland, Ambassador Yaroslav Suhopers, I hope I get it right, management of the Faculty of Design and the members of the University of Warsaw, Poland, respectable speakers and all the participants. Right. So first of all, I'd like to congratulate Malaysia and Poland for having 50th anniversary of cooperation, diplomatic cooperation and relationship between these two countries. It is a long time indeed, 50 years, and I think there are a lot of achievements have been met for this 50 years time. So I hope it will be better in the future. So, and secondly, I would like to congratulate all the researchers from both university, UPM, as well as University of Warsaw, for successfully organized this webinar, okay, the tale of contrasting cities, Warsaw and Kuala Lumpur. Either these two cities are very well contradict. This is something that we would like to listen and further analyze later. But it is, in my humble opinions, that by understanding the contrast, we will also find similarities between these two cities. And understanding these contrasts and similarities will help us to improve our urban quality of living, consequently the humanities as a whole. This is something that the universities, especially the school or colleges or faculty related to design and architecture, is striving for. And for us, through our Master in Tropical Urban Design. And it is very, I have very good feeling when the Ambassador of Malaysia to Poland welcomed us to work closely to look into Poland, into how to improve our urban design, our urban environment, and so forth. All right, this is something that I think is a very important notes that have been presented to us by Your Excellency. All right, so thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. So This webinar allow mutual cooperation between these two universities, especially the lecturers involved. Even though we are living 1,000 kilometers apart, nothing is stopping us actually to cooperate, especially in this digital era. I hope that the cooperation will not stop here, but will further continue in many aspects and formats. Last, I would like to congratulate the organizers and all the distinguished speakers. I would like to hear, and I expect to hear a lot of a good thing and new thing from all of you. I wish all the best, and I'm looking forward to hear from you all the great ideas and stories. Right? For all, stay safe and stay strong. Please be vaccinated. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Sohardi. All right. Before we start, I would like to again remind the audience to put your microphone in silence. We will call you back when we need the backup singer later. So for now, I hope the other audience can turn off your microphone. Thank you very much. All right. Now we are going to the sessions with the first presenter, Mariana Issa from International Council on Monuments and Site Malaysia, or known as ICOMOS Malaysia. Before I call upon Mariana, I will read briefly on her background. Mariana Issa is the co-director of Heritage Output Lab, a research studio founded together with Manganjit Kaur. They are the authors of Kuala Lumpur Street Names, Towns of Malaya, and Between the Bay of Bengal and Java Sea. Their team also contains consultants for Kuala Lumpur City Hall's Planned Heritage Trail interpretive panels. She is an architecture graduate from University Technology Malaysia and holds a Master Sign in Conservation of Historic Buildings from the University of Bath. Her experience includes working with non-governmental organizations that are related to built and cultural heritage, and is at present the Secretary General of ICOMOS Malaysia. Ladies and gentlemen, Mariana will take us down the memory lane through the beautiful images of Kuala Lumpur in the olden days. With that, I pass the screen to Mariana for her presentation.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Shireen, and thank you, Joe, for the promo. Let me just open my screen here. I think it's all good, yeah? Can you see my screen? Shireen?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
yes,
okay.
we can. Yeah,
Okay, just wanted to check if it's working.
yeah.
I'm really happy to be here. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak. I'm always excited to share about the history of my hometown, Kuala Lumpur. And because it's too complicated to compress into a 20-minute slot, what I want to do today instead is take you back through time, through selected maps and photographs, to get a glimpse of bygone Kuala Lumpur, how it used to look like a long time ago. And the opening photograph here was taken sometime in 1910. So this building in the foreground is our Kuala Lumpur railway station under construction. It was opened on the 1st of July, 1911. So actually this Thursday, it turns exactly 110 years old. So here in the making is what was going to be the most beautiful railway station in the Far East, and the Mughal eclectic architecture with the pointed arches, the chhatris, the minarets. This was or had already been set as a look for Kuala Lumpur, like 14 to 15 years earlier, because the people in charge back then wanted the government administration center to look somehow palatial. And what's important is this, the existence of this grand railway station here showcases Kuala Lumpur's booming economy, which initially stemmed from the tin mining industry, mid-1800s. So as you can see, this is a map from 1904. But Kuala Lumpur is located inland. So back then it was still under Selangor, and the nearest entry point from the Straits of Malacca was through a port in Klang. And Klang is a much more established and older settlement. But what was unique to Kuala Lumpur's position was that it is central to several tin mining districts, such as the ones that are marked here: Batu, Ampang, Sungai Besi, Petaling. So if you live or if you visited Kuala Lumpur, these names should be familiar. So all the tin ores were collected in Kuala Lumpur before transported to Klang. And back in the day, the main means of communications was this meandering Klang River, and it would take you 3 days to travel between Klang and Kuala Lumpur by boat or steamer. And a shortcut, like kind of a shortcut, a road was built to shorten the time, Damansara Road, about 15 miles, and it only shortened the distance to about slightly more than half a day. So still with that, the cost to transport tin from Kuala Lumpur to Klang was just as much the cost to send the tin from Klang to England. So there's guy, his name is Swettenham. He managed to convince the big boys to invest in building a railway line to connect Kuala Lumpur to Bukit Kuda, just outside of Klang. And it only took 95 minutes to travel. And of course, this line was further extended to a new port, Port Swettenham, named after the same guy. Now, geographically, Kuala Lumpur is located at the confluence of two rivers in a valley surrounded by hilly areas. And if you look at this area here on the right, I hope you can see my laser pointer. The blue ponds are actually the tin mines of Ampang. And if you combine the area, the size together, it seems like it would have been slightly bigger, if not half the size of Kuala Lumpur town center. So if you understand the scale, you understand why Ampang Mines was one of the richest mines in Selangor when it was first opened late 1800s. So traveling from Klang to Kuala Lumpur, as you approach the town, you'll meet with the confluence I mentioned just now, and the river on the left is Gomba River. It will take you to Batu village, or the Batu mines I mentioned, and then Klang River continues to the right, and it will bring you to Ampang. Now the river was, it's not that deep. It actually, from this point onwards, it became too shallow for heavy boats laden with tin, people, miners and all to pass. So naturally, they had to stop by somewhere here. And there would have been a few landing points along the river, along the way, but this became the major landing point before the miners continued their journey by land to all the mines. So this road would take them to Batu, Ampang, Kudu, Petaling, and all. These, their early tracks is what formed our main road network, and it remains as our major road until today. So settlements were established around the landing point and along the major roads. There were a few swampy areas, such as this area was rather swampy in the beginning. And then the British moved their administration to Kuala Lumpur in 1880, and they settled themselves on the hillier sides to the west before relocating their administration center to the plain here, closer to the natives, but still divided by the river. And then this portion where I've marked in green, the railways took over the land, the strip down to Brickfields, where KL Central is today. So KL Central is now currently our main transportation hub. Okay, so this is a panoramic photograph of Kuala Lumpur taken circa 1884. And this would have been 12 years after the Battle of Kuala Lumpur ended, which was part of a very long, complicated, and taxing civil war. So I'm going to skip all that. You can see the houses are all made of timber, mud, bamboo, and all roofed and thatched. So we're going to look at every segment of that photo just now. There's actually 4 segments. Right here, is the plane I mentioned before the administration center was relocated here. And fast forward 73 years, this would be the point where the Union Jack flag was lowered down and the Malayan flag was raised for the first time on the eve of our independence in 1957. I mean, like, who would have thought? And the best part about all these photographs nowadays, we can view them in super high resolution, and you could actually see clearly the details and what was going on, like more activities instead of the scenery. So right here, for example, I'll zoom out, is the Gomba Bridge, a timber bridge that went across Gomba River to Batu Road. And then you can see, if you look closely, the road here looks like it's being metal, in the process of being metal. You can see people ramping, compressing the gravel of the crushers. And this buffalo cart probably carrying some construction materials. You can see that they're building a drain here. This light, the lampstand is made of wood painted in white, and it was lighted with coconut oil every evening, 6 p.m. to 4 a.m. So KL was already lighted by then. And then if we move to the other side, we'll see Market Street here, named Market Street because it led to the main market in this portion. If you zoom in, you can see the Chinese houses, because it's typical of the early Chinese houses, and a vegetable garden here, a horse carriage, a pony. Actually, I think it's a pony. And we look at the river, and this blow up really excited me because I've been trying to get a glimpse of how the Klang River used to look like. And this I think you can see, right? There's a river there. This fits William Hornaday, the American naturalist, description of Kuala Lumpur when he visited in 1878. He said, all along the riverbank, the house of the Malays stood in solid row on piles 10 feet high, directly over the swift and muddy current. And I think if you remember how Malaysia used to look like, at least up to the 1960s, 70s, these scenes would be familiar. And the three-tiered structure here was the Jawa Street Mosque, the central religious center for the Muslims or for the Malays back then. Here in the foreground was what was going to become the railway yard, railway terminus, which was to complete 2 years later in 1886. And you could see construction workers here. So I'm going to blow up. They're construction workers taking a break under a shed. And they were probably filling up the land, because this area was also described as a little bit swampy. You can see their basket shovels here. So they're taking a break, and it must have been really humid because everyone's half naked. But that was how it was back then. And even from afar, you could actually view the Chinese graveyards on the hill and the Athap houses so close to each other. And this building here, it seems larger than the others. It's actually typical of that period, with a perimeter veranda to deal with the heat and the rain. And then you have a small bridge here, because Kuala Lumpur had a lot of ravines, and it was quite common to have these kind of bridges back then. All, of course, filled up already. In this photo in the background is what I think was the Chinese Kongsis, but I have to honestly say I've not really looked into that. But obviously here is a coconut plantation, right? And then here under this shed is a sawmill. People, carpenters at work, ready for construction. And change at this point, I think, was obviously about to come. And it was probably something that the people back then was looking forward to, because they were still recovering from two major tragedies that happened just 3 years before, in 1881. I hope I'm not going too fast. I'm trying to fit in the 20 minutes, but these photos are amazing. So what happened was, on the 4th of January, 1881, there was a big fire caused by some careless opium smokers who accidentally overturned their oil lamp. There were 2,260 people living in Kuala Lumpur in 1880. It was recorded, but this fire caused 500 people to lose their homes, and like I think 3 people died. But everything was basically reduced to ashes. And when they thought things couldn't get any worse, in December that year, there was a really bad flood. So on the 21st of December, rain didn't stop for 30 hours or so. So the waters raised up into the shop houses, the bridges floated away. The Malay settlements, the houses along the river were all underwater, about 10 feet high. They recorded like 92 to 100 something bamboo houses were also damaged, floated away, and people had to be rescued by boat. So everyone, and when I say everyone, this includes the Europeans who were there, everyone had to start back from zero. And so measurements for town improvements had to be taken. And among them was first land reclamation. Land reclamation, followed by a series of river alignment in the later years. But here is the area I marked yellow is one of the swampy areas I showed earlier. Today it's known as Jalan Malacca. Reclamation in this portion were done in phases in the next 1 or 2 decades using soil taken from the adjacent hills such as Bukit Nanas. And then a proper sewerage system was constructed. And to those who in Kuala Lumpur who's always curious about these underground secret tunnels, my hunch is that they were actually all sewage tunnels, because look at how big it is. It could fit 2 persons easily. And then building regulations were introduced, and this is very important. So all the buildings had to be built in brick, 1884 onwards, they must use clay tiles. Roads have to be a minimum width of 20 feet, all this to reduce the risk of fire. And then after that, all shop houses has to have a 5-foot walkway along the shop front as a public right of way. There was a bit of zoning. So for example, businesses with hazardous materials such as kerosene were all relocated out of the town center. So this is Kuala Lumpur in 1888, specifically Petaling Street. You can see the houses on the shop houses on the right under construction with the materials I mentioned. So with all of that in place, it really influenced how Kuala Lumpur would grow in the next decade. And this is how Kuala Lumpur looked like in 1897. So it was made the federal capital of Federated Malay States on the 1st of July, 1896. So again, this Thursday marks exactly the 125th anniversary of Kuala Lumpur being a city center, a capital city. So there's a lot to celebrate this Thursday. And I mentioned that the British settled themselves on the hillier area, right? So here you can see the old British residency, the British residency, which became the home of our first prime minister, and this building is still standing. And then on this side, today we call it Bukit Aman, was the police barracks, and the police have maintained their presence at the same hill until today. And this beautiful building in the center, zoom in, this is what we call today Bangunan Sultan Abdul Samad. This was where our Federal Secretariat Office was, our council chamber, where all the major decisions were made. And this was the first Mughal architecture building that Kuala Lumpur became so well known for. So the best part is you get to zoom in. So here you can see Market Street has already transformed. And then here, yeah, I would just wanted to zoom. You can see a stack of timber wood, which we think was used maybe for cooking. Maybe it was stored for cooking. And then rubbish bins were already introduced. And the bin looks exactly like how it still looks like today. So no design evolution there. And at the center here, it's a very important building. This is the Cincia Temple. And it's one of the oldest Chinese temples in Kuala Lumpur. And people say that the prosperity of Kuala Lumpur will be affected if this temple is ever relocated from this exact spot. Perhaps it's our, part of our feng shui. Now, you can see that there's a lot of Chinese elements in the architecture, very apparent in the roof detail. But among this, remember the Jawa street malls that I mentioned, you can actually see the tip of it here. So it was still in existence. I colored it in orange. It was still in existence back then. Probably the last of the remaining few timber buildings in the city, the big timber buildings in the city back then. And then what is this group of trees? So these greenery concentration mark the open spaces. This is actually the triangle where Bangkok Bank is. We called it Bangkok Bank, but Bangkok Bank's no longer there. So at these pocket spaces is where people would hang out and trade in the open, like street sellers and all would operate. And here you can see a concentration of coconut trees, which marks the burial ground of the Malays, the Muslim burial ground, located at the confluence of that river I mentioned just now, the confluence of Gomba and Klang River. Okay, so how did Kuala Lumpur look like from the street level? This is Cross Street at the junction with Pudu Street. You can see that there was that, like odd-looking Chinese tower house. You can see the top of it right here. And the road is obviously still dirt road. You can see the carriage tracks. Let's zoom a little. There's a water bucket there, and horse carriages. So my good friend Shaiful Shahidan noticed that the carriages are actually all static. They're not moving. So this could have been sort of like a horse buggy point, like a taxi point where people would come to get a ride back home. And my friend Dennis also identified that these two buildings are still in existence. So this is 1889, so the building's about 118 years old today. And then back to that concentration, that you remember that coconut tree concentration, the Malay burial ground. You can see the gravestones there. Yeah, so this is Gomba River, and you could see people were bathing, washing, the buffaloes were cooling themselves in the river. No big a deal back then. And then there's this footpath that leads to this side. Yeah, so it's the same. It's still Gomba River, but maybe on a quieter day. And then this is in 1897. River transportation at this point was no longer operating. And you can see the riverside where all those houses on stilts were are no longer there. So it's the same. Sorry, I think there's a distortion. Is that me or is that someone's computer? This is
someone is they do not unmute their.
Okay, all right, because I was afraid that it's actually my mic. Okay, so there you can see that some early river alignment has been constructed, and if we look at this guy, I mean, like this guy, I'm always curious. We're always curious what he's doing there, and his features look very Indian, but his hairstyle's a bit different. And then if you look closer at the river, I think you can see the landing point, the old landing point. You got steps going upwards into Cross Street, actually. My friend Dennis Ong was the one who noticed this. Very sharp eyes. And then you can see someone here sitting on the steps, which was the river access. So you see the steps was maybe about 1 story high. And these were all replaced with an embankment. An embankment road was built in the 1900s, a few years later. So that's the river. I think it's similar to what Malacca used to look like my very vague memory of that. But here are actually what I think outdoor toilets, maybe storage, I don't know, but definitely, even if it were toilets, would be a bit stinky as you approach KL from the river, because river was already ignored back then. We were already using the roads as major access. And here is what KB Tiong thinks it's a compactor. But you can see there's some construction going on, and you can see more of that activities right here. So Sultan Abdul Samad building was just completed. So I think these workers are clearing up the site. And at the back, you can see the Market Street Bridge already in metal at this point of time. And Kuala Lumpur was affected by the World War. Malaya was under the Japanese occupation for about 3 years, from 1942 to 1945. But what I've learned from old documents is that the Japanese actually managed to reconstruct and rebuild all the bombed roads and bridges within 2 years. So in that sense, they were efficient. And here is Kuala Lumpur in the 1950s. It doesn't look it doesn't look like this today, but you can see that the footprint is similar. You can still find a glimpse of the old Kuala Lumpur in town today. And the open space right here is where our Twin Towers is today. That's actually the race course. And then if you recall the 1884 photo, the plane I mentioned, it became like a recreational sports hub, like a field where people played football, cricket, hockey, and this is the administration center. And that's Market Street, and that's Market Street Bridge. And the 1884 photo, remember those construction workers under the shed? That would have been somewhere here. And then that sawmill we saw is somewhere here. So this is my last photograph. This is of Embankment Road in the 1960s. And you can see that the road is being resurfaced. I think in Kuala Lumpur, there's always something that's undergoing construction. We are always resurfacing our roads. And perhaps it's now finally time for us to take things slower and start digging. And while there isn't much history to share within these 20 minutes, I hope the photographs I shared help you to imagine how Kuala Lumpur used to look like, bygone Kuala Lumpur, and understand how far we've come. Thank you. Is that 20 minutes?
Yes, Mariana,
Yeah,
fantastic.
okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mariana.
Let me figure out how to, stop sharing. Thank you. Thank you again.
From one of the photographs, I think now we know who were the culprit for making our Gomba River very muddy now. The buffalo. All right. We will take and if the audience has any question for Mariana, we will take it after the last presenter. Yeah, thank you again, Mariana, for a very nostalgic presentation.
Thank you.
Yep, welcome. Okay, all right. For the next presenter, we have Professor Hubert Kowalski and Monica Dunaico from the University of Warsaw. So, Monica, will there be both of you and Professor Hubert?
Unfortunately, only me. And first of all, on behalf of Professor Kowalski, I would like to apologize to you, but he has an urgent meeting with the university rector, and I hope he will join us later.
Okay, before that, may I read both of you, your background, a very brief background here. Professor Hubert Kowalski is an assistant professor at the Department of Archaeology, University of Warsaw. His research focused in the reception of the artistic culture of the ancient Greece and Rome in the European art of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And Monica Dunaico is a graduate of Italian philology and archaeology at the University of Warsaw and a PhD candidate in Doctoral School of Humanities. She is an adjunct at the University of Warsaw Museum and an author of several exhibitions. Next, let us bask in the magnificent scenery of the old and new Warsaw. With that, I would like to invite Monica Dunaico for her presentation titled The Short History of Warsaw.
Thank
So the
you very
screen is
much.
yours. Yep.
And I try to share my screen. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks you once again. I try to tell you the short story of the short history of Warsaw, and as you may know, Warsaw, which is now the capital of Poland and also its largest city, is located in Central Europe along the middle course of Vistula River. And even in Roman times, it was part of a trade route between the Baltic Sea and the Mediterranean. Nevertheless, Warsaw had not always been the most important city in Poland. As a country, Poland was founded in the 10th century. And however, the centuries of the young state were not concentrated in the middle reaches of the Vistula River in Mazovian region. So these areas, which remained on the sidelines, retained their individuality for a long time. So the aim of the presentation is to show you the history of Warsaw from the beginning of its existence until 1918. It will focus on the historical aspects that influence the significance of functioning of the city, as well as the changes in the urban fabric. We will trace how Warsaw grew from a small settlement on the Vistula River to become the most important Polish city, its administrative, cultural and economic capital. The, the exact date of the founding of Warsaw is unknown. The city dates back to the turn of 13th and 14th century, when it was established close to an existing stronghold which guarded the crossing on the Vistula River, and at the same time provided security for Warsaw. In the first period of its existence, Warsaw covered a relatively small area which encompassed today's Old Town and was typically Gothic in character, that it was characterized by a very rigid street layout resembling a grid radiating from a rectangular marketplace, all of which was surrounded by walls. From the end of the 14th century, Warsaw also became the seat of the Dukes of Mazovia, who gradually extended the brick residence. Warsaw was constantly expanding. The new town was built outside the walls of the old town, which at the beginning of the 15th century was granted town privileges. However, its economic development did not lead to the development of the intellectual or artistic spheres. No higher school was established, no serious scholars or artists gathered here, and Krakow was the untapped leader in these fields. In the 16th century, Warsaw began to gain more and more importance. The fields close to Warsaw became the traditional place for electing kings of Polish and Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the place where the parliament was convened. Warsaw lay halfway between Krakow, the capital of Poland, and Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, and at that time both countries made up the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was the largest country in Central Europe. Moreover, the court of the then reigning King Sigismund III Vasa moved to Warsaw, thereby determining Warsaw's popularity and development. The royal court became the main center of intellectual and artistic life, and the successive rulers became the patrons of scholars and artists. The city became an informal capital. The official capital was still Krakow, where the coronation of kings took place, as well as their burials. However, it was Warsaw that the private residence of successive rulers were built, like the Villa Regia, ujazdów or wilanów. In the 16th century, Warsaw was still quite small. There were 487 houses in the old town and only 204 in the new town. However, it was rebuilt. The wooden houses were transformed into brick ones. Upper floors were added, and the fronts were covered with polychrome paintings. The relocation of the royal court to Warsaw resulted in the town's spatial development and expansion. State and church dignitaries moved here along with the ruler and his court, but above all deputies and senators who invested in mansions and palaces. They purchased land on the outskirts of the city around the old and the new towns, where they built mansions, palaces, gardens, churches, and the buildings in Warsaw's suburbs were somewhat chaotic, but of a high architectural level. And here we can see the view of Warsaw before the war with Sweden, during which a lot of buildings, a lot of palaces were ruined. The next major changes in the appearance of Warsaw took place in the first half of the 18th century, during the reign of the Wettin dynasty, which had its roots of Saxony, today's Germany. And one of the most beautiful architectural projects in Warsaw was conceived at the time, a huge palace garden complex, which included a Baroque palace, a ceremonial courtyard, stables, guardhouses, residential pavilions, a gate, a moat, a drawbridge, and a garden modeled on the one in Versailles. This conceptual design, called the Saxonian Axe, was larger than the entire old town, and the intention was to emphasize the informal character of the town as a capital city. It's also delineated the east-west as well as north-south routes for communication. During the reign of the last king of Poland, Stanisław August Poniatowski, in the second half of the 18th century, attempts were made to organize Warsaw from the urban perspective. Warsaw developed very quickly and became a large capital city. The number of inhabitants grew, resulting in its systematic enlargement and the construction of numerous palace buildings like the Tyszkiewicz Palace, or the palace on the Isle built for the king himself. And during the reign of Stanisław August, Warsaw experienced a real cultural development. The first secular school, the School of Officer Cadets, was opened. The Commission of National Education, which was the first central institution of education in the world, was founded. The National Theatre was opened. Art collections were assigned. Painters, sculptors, architects were brought to Warsaw. Urban and cultural development was accompanied by economic revival. A mine was opened, factories, brickyards, and manufacturers were built. And finally, in May 1791, the first constitution in Europe was adopted in Warsaw. However, this momentum did not last long. In 1795, Poland lost its independence, and its territory was divided among Russia, Austria, and Prussia. And at the same time, Warsaw ceased to be the capital of an independent country and became a provincial town of the Partitioning states. During this period, the city became the main center of the struggle to regain independence. As a result of the Napoleonic Wars in 1807, the Duchy of Warsaw was created. It was a free state with its own constitution, but dependent on the French Empire and Napoleon. However, the situation did not last long as well. After Napoleon's defeat, the end of Napoleonic Wars, and his abdication in 1840 till 1815, the Congress of Vienna, which was an international conference of representatives of 16 European countries, was convened, and during this conference, the Kingdom of Poland was formed from the lands of former Duchy of Warsaw. It was a a state united with the Russian Empire by a personal union, but completely dependent on it and under its permanent control. Warsaw became the capital of Kingdom of Poland, and during this period, the University of Warsaw was established, which resulted in an influx of intelligentsia, scholars, and artists. And here you can see the University of Warsaw at its very beginning and how it looks like now. And it's like the campus is like a small town within a huge town. The character of Warsaw also changed and it began to function as an academic city. However, the efforts to regain independence continued. Warsaw was still the spiritual and patriotic center of Polnisches, a place where conspiratorial activities and uprisings were organized. The total loss of independence, the loss of autonomy and decline in formal significance occurred after the fall of the uprising in 1831. The Russians introduced a series of repressions, like they closed the university, they banned the special expansions of the city, introduced a Russian monetary system, and Russified the administration. Warsaw took on the character of fortress city, the central element of which was built at the expense of the Kingdom of Poland, with a strong Russian garrison, also stationed here. The citadel was a strategic point from which to control and pacify any signs of struggle for independence. 76 houses had to be demolished, over 64,000 properties occupied, and the forcible resettlement of up to 15,000 local inhabitants in order to build this fortification. The work was carried out with labor in the form of both soldiers and peasants brought in mainly from Russia. The citadel encompassed a total of 36 hectares and was laid out on the pentagonal plan with its longest side adjacent to the Vistula escarpment. It consisted of 3 bastions with 2 half bastions and a dry moat. The building also served as a prison for detaining national activists and also as a place for their execution. Today, of course, there is no prison here, and on this pentagonal area is going to open a museum of history of Poland and also a modern building for the Polish Army Museum. During that period, the focus was also on the city's internal development because, as I told you before, there was banned the special expansion of the city. The city was very disordered from the architecture perspective. For example, tall 7 or 8 story tenement houses stood alongside low-rise building, and there was a lack of green spaces. The old town, which today is one of the most charming places in the city, was inhabited basically only by poor people. There were also objects that testified to the Russification of these areas, symbol of Russian rule over Poland. For example, Orthodox churches were particularly promoted, and approximately about 20 churches were built in Warsaw alone, including the St. Alexander Nevsky Cathedral on Saski Square, just in front of a huge palace garden complex, which I told you before. It was one of the most important squares in the city. And also the Staszic Palace, which previously housed the Royal Society of Friends of Science, was rebuilt in the Byzantine Russian style, and therefore previously unknown architecture forms with onion-shaped domes, decoration alluding to Russian folk designs, appear on the Vistula River. The situation in Warsaw changed during the First World War. In 1950, the Russians were driven out of the city by the German army. The local government in Warsaw regained partial autonomy, which is reflected in the revival of political and cultural life, as well as in the revival of Polish University of Warsaw. It is decided to extend the city limits and build new districts with spacious housing areas and green areas. The surface area of the city more than tripled, and Poland regained its independence finally in November 1980 after 123 years. And the rebirth of the independent state was connected to the spatial development of the capital, due partially to the need to erect new public buildings for administrative needs. New housing estates were built, as well as a new seat for the National Museum, the renovation of palaces, the renovation of the arsenal. Warsaw medieval walls were discovered, and infrastructure was developed. For example, the expansion of public transport, the preparation of a project for a new bridge in Warsaw, and underground network, modernization of hospitals, and the laying out of parks and green areas. To sum up, over the course of nearly 700 years, Warsaw has experienced a series of events, as we saw, both positives and negative, which have their mark on the city's architecture. From a small medieval town to the seat of successive Polish rulers, and later a provisional city of the Persianic powers, it finally became the capital of independent country. And I will stop here.
You are right on time. Thank you very much. Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
I think it's I have to compliment you, because it's quite a task to cram the long history of Warsaw into less than 20 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right. After hearing about the historical part of Warsaw, we will hear the modern era of Warsaw with our third presenter. Hello, Dr. Katarzyna Wagner. She's from the University of Warsaw. I was lucky to have met her at the National Museum of Warsaw in December 2019. So if you're in Warsaw, please do visit the beautiful National Museum. Yeah. Before Dr. Katarzyna start her presentation, let me read her background. Dr. Katarzyna Wagner received her PhD in history in 2017 from the Faculty of History, University of Warsaw. Since 2017, she is an assistant professor at the Department of Early Modern History at the University of Warsaw. She is also, her research interests focus on the history of Polish cities, economic history, spoils of war, and relations between Poland and Sweden in the early modern times. Since December 2018, she is the Deputy Director for the Research at National Museum in Warsaw. Dr. Katarzyna will share with us in her presentation the devastating impact of the two world wars in Warsaw. With that, I welcome Dr. Katarzyna on her presentation titled Warsaw 1918 to 2018, a city with 4 episodes. So Dr. Katarzyna, I pass the screen to you now.
Thank you. We will stay on...
Yes, yeah.
Okay, we will stay on historical topics for a while longer because I will... Oh, all right, it should be fine now. These 4 episodes from the title of my presentation in the history of Warsaw spent more than 100 years although the last one is still ongoing. The two world wars, its role as capital of the Polish People's Republic and the period after the fall of communism after 1989 are basic holds for the dating of events over the past 100 years. These were complex and very diversified times. They can be compared to the troughs and crests of wave, which brought seas of pain and suffering, enormous destruction to the fabric of the city and its inhabitants, as well as recurring periods full of hope, reconstruction, and development. The point of presentation is to point out the key events in the history of 20th century Warsaw and to show their impact on the city's development, the changes in the architecture and urban planning, which Marek will present in more details. Due to the limited time, I have decided to divide my presentation into three sections. The First World War, which was the period leading to Poland's return to the maps of Europe and the world. The Second World War and the post-war period, which was the time of reconstruction during the People's Republic of Poland, as well as the transformation after the fall of communism. When the First World War broke out, Warsaw has no special function. It was just one of many cities in the Russian Empire. The unsuccessful Russo-Japanese War and the revolution of 1905 caused a crisis in Russia, so any further plans had to be revised. At that time, the most important thing for the Tsar was frugality, which was achieved mainly through the reform of the army and reducing investments that were not a priority. One such investment was the Warsaw Fortress with the citadel, which Monica pointed in her presentation. In 1909, Tsar Nicholas Romanov ordered that it be dismantled. Of course, the demolition work continued until the outbreak of the war in 1914. The main effect of this decision was for the city to lift restrictions on the development of this area. Russia's position changed along with the official outbreak of the First World War and also fueled hopes for Poland to regain its independence. In October 1914, the German army was stopped near Warsaw by reinforcements brought in by the Russians. The situation seemed to be under control for Russians at that time. Some of the inhabitants returned to the city, and the Tsarist authorities eased many of the bans that had been in force until then. At the start of the following year, 1915, the armies of the Central Powers achieved several victories of the Eastern Front. It became clear that the Tsarist army would be unable to hold on to its previous position. And so began the evacuation of officials, equipment and machines from factories, as well as museum collections, including available municipal funds. On 5th of August 1915, the Germans entered Warsaw, and the retreating Russians burned down railway station and either destroyed or damaged the bridges so as to hinder the pursuit of German troops. In turn, the Germans began by building new temporary bridges and rebuilding railway lines to make up for the losses made by retreating Russian army. Also in August 1915, the general government of Warsaw was set up, headed by General Hans von Besseler. The political machine of the German occupying forces was supported by organization committee of the city of Warsaw, consisting of Poles whose aim was to organize the administration and secure buildings that had been plundered by the retreating Russians. The Mazovian region, including Warsaw itself, under German occupation, was no longer a place of armed skirmishes. The Germans allowed to reopening the university and the Polytechnic of Warsaw. Education was subordinated to the Polish authorities, where civil courts were replaced by German ones. Further, Warsaw's further development was greatly influenced by the incorporation of suburbs, 1916, thus enlarging the city's surface area threefold. To enable further growth, including the areas adjacent to the citadel that had previously been occupied by the esplanades of the Warsaw Fortress. The German authorities granted the Poles freedom in their cultural, academic, and educational activities, as well as allowing them limited political activity, which helped strengthen their anti-Russian attitude and inspire trust, which over time turned into the German complete exploitation of the conquered territory. The German occupation led to the collapse of industry and trade in Warsaw, which resulted in the impoverishment of its inhabitants. Problems with supplies were systematically encountered. The army exported both food and raw materials to Germany, which is why the end of the First World War was marked by very poor social and economic situation in both Warsaw and in the whole Mazovian region. The Germans also removed looted items ranging from museum collections to railway rolling stock and municipal supplies. The revolution in Germany and their situation at the front led to the departure of Governor Hans von Besseler with the withdrawal of German troops. The disarmament of the last German units began, as well as the removal of traces of their presence. A few days later, Józef Piłsudski, commander of the Polish legions, returned to Warsaw, where he was entrusted by the Poles with military power. It was a sign that the functions that belonged to Warsaw would soon be restored, including political and economic ones. The potential of this area and the role that Warsaw had played in the past predetermined that it would be regain its key place as a major city. In November 1980, Warsaw became the capital, the official capital of independent Poland. Moreover, after 123 years, Poland returned to the maps of Europe and the world. At the beginning of the 20th century, the city had less than 600,000 inhabitants, while 30 years later it had a population more than 1 million. It is therefore easy to figure out that the post-war economic crisis and the financial needs of the sovereign state prevented the city's development, also in terms of construction work. It was not until the stabilization of the population in the 30s and also new president's policy of extending the infrastructure and improving the living conditions of Warsaw residents that the housing situation gradually began to improve. In December 1938, Warsaw extended its borders for the last time before the outbreak of the Second World War. Planning for the city's further development was hampered by war damage, hyperinflation, and pauperization of the inhabitants. Overcoming these difficulties was made possible by a loan in American dollars, thanks to which, but also thanks to the prudent and frugal policy of city authorities, the municipal infrastructure, the water supply and sewage system, power, gas, and tramway lines was extended. Many schools and housing estates were built, roads were modernized, including those leading to Warsaw. A building was constructed, but industry was also activated, thus providing funds for other investments. The outbreak of the Second World War had a far more dramatic impact on Warsaw than the events at the beginning of the century. On 1st of September 1939, German forces began air raids on Poland. Less than a month of defeating Warsaw against the German Wehrmacht resulted a great deal of damage, caused mainly by aerial bombing. As a result of these raids, the royal castle was burned down. The old town and adjacent districts were also bombed. Municipal appliances were destroyed. The water supply and sewage system were not functioning. There was no electricity. Access to the radio and press was also impeded. The German air raids stopped only after Warsaw capitulated at the end of September. Those marking the start of the city's occupation. Warsaw lost its status as capital. A lot from the local population was terrorized and sent to concentration camps. A ghetto was also set up for the Jewish population. The German plan was to demolish and destroy Warsaw and to build a new German center on its ruins. The activities of the Polish underground movement led to the outbreak of an uprising in Warsaw in 1944, which ended with the defeat of the Polish side. As a result, approximately 16,000 insurgents and 150,000 civilians died. The remainder were deported for forced labor. The city was almost completely destroyed. It is estimated that 70% of it was ruined, including industry, official buildings, residential buildings, and cultural property, while as much as 80 to 85% of the old town may have been destroyed. At the end of 1944, the Soviet army captured the right bank districts of Warsaw, and at the beginning of 1945, also the left bank's districts, after which the defeated German left Poland and Warsaw itself. From that movement on, the Polish authorities were in charge, but they were pro-Soviet. At the end of the 40s, the political situation changed. The communist authorities dealt with the legal opposition and proceeded to build the foundation of socialism in line with the Soviet model. Freedom of speech and discussion was suppressed. The basis for the country's development in this period was the principle of central control by the state authorities, for instance, setting the standards of production and development in plans spanning several years. This soon provided impossible, however, which is why these plans were continually modified or adapted to meet new requirements. The plan for the development of the country, so-called six-year plan, was provided for the intensive industrialization of the country and the accelerated collectivization of agriculture. When the Korean War, the first armed conflict of the Cold War, broke out in June 1950s, here's somebody, the authorities in Moscow feared the outbreak of another global war. Therefore, they tried to protect themselves by ordering the People's Republic of Warsaw to increase expenditure of armaments and heavy industry. Therefore, decisions were made based on the ideologies and needs of the Soviet Union rather than one on the possibility of achieving real profit or supporting the development of People's Republic of Poland. It should be remembered, however, that these huge investments also provided opportunities for the social advancement of the rural population, which was willingly taken advantage of. The other side of the coin was that a change of place of residence, uprooting a lack of authority led to indoctrination. Warsaw became a symbol of revival, although in the context of the new political system, this revival sounded strange and alien to its inhabitants. The city was also to become a huge industrial center, attracting workers from all over the country. The major challenge for this period was, above all, the reconstruction of Warsaw as the capital of People's Republic, especially since the Central Party authorities tried to interfere in the shape of the reconstruction, regardless of the country's financial possibilities. The old town was a particular importance for the communists since its reconstruction was to legitimize the new regime. As time passed, the enthusiasm for interfering in the plans of architects and urban planners for the reconstruction of the city waned. They were a rather isolated situation in which the authorities wanted, for example, additional ornaments in line with their individual tastes rather than diametrical changes. The historical facades of buildings stylized resemble those of earlier centuries were ideologically important to show the construction of a progressive country in accordance with an at least assembled respect for tradition and the city's past. The lack of consensus between the central authorities and architects became apparent in the case of the royal castle. Neither party could reach agreement on the concept for its reconstruction until the 70s, while, for example, the Old Town Square was opened in 1953. After the fall of communism, in May 1990, the Sejm passed an act on the establishment of Warsaw, and soon afterwards the inhabitants elected the first democratic authorities. The uncompleted work and the previous period were gradually put in order, including the administrative division of the city. The population of Warsaw gradually increased and is still growing. Currently, it's 1.8 million inhabitants. Its borders have also been extended. Since the beginning of the 1990s, Warsaw has been experiencing rapid development both from the economic and the investment perspective. Today, it's the capital where the most important state offices, administrative headquarters, universities, and headquarters of domestic and foreign companies are located. To sum up, although the First World War treated Warsaw relatively gently, the city and its inhabitants once again in the history experienced trauma and destruction, but its most important value, along with that of the whole country, sovereignty, was regained. However, it was not possible to enjoy this freedom because after just 21 years, the outbreak of Second World War affected the citizens of Warsaw in a brutal way. The destruction of city's fabric, its heritage, as well as the enormous loss of lives left their mark for many years to come. The Polish People's Republic was a period of reconstruction and ensemble development manifested in investments which exceeded the economic potential and the country and the city, mainly in armaments and heavy industry. It was also a time of indoctrination and decision-making by the central authorities based on the ideology and plans of the Soviet Union rather than on the real needs and possibilities from the country and its capital city. However, since the end of the First World War, Warsaw has played a key role in the country. Cultural organization, academic institutions, and trade unions have been active here. Official political events on a national scale have taken place here, and manufactories and industrial plants have had their headquarters here. Warsaw's specialness lies, among other things, in its ability to recover from military defeats and failures, and the fact that it cherishes a difficult historical memory. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Katarzyna. You are on the dot for 20 minutes. So it's a very interesting presentation. I think there are many questions for you, but we keep it until the last presenter. Again, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. Okay, next, for our last presenter, we will have Dr. Mari Kozlowski from University Putra Malaysia. While he's getting ready for your slide, Dr. Mari, may I read your biography? Dr. Mari Kozlowski is currently a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Design and Architecture, University Putra Malaysia. He graduated from the University of Queensland as an urban planner and completed his master's in architecture at the Technical University in Krakow, Poland. He received his PhD in urban design at the University of Queensland. He has worked as an urban planner in Brisbane and Gold Coast City Councils, and as an architect, urban planner, or urban designer for private consultancies in Queensland, Australia, Poland, United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. He has recently published a book, Kuala Lumpur, Community Infrastructure and Urban Inclusivity. With that, I would like to call upon Dr. Mari to present his slides with his presentation on the title Urbanism in Kuala Lumpur and Warsaw, a comparative analysis.
Thank you, Shireen. Just let me find get the presentation.
I think while we're waiting for Dr. Mari, you will be amazed how so many similarities between Kuala Lumpur and Warsaw. I think Dr. Mari will share with us later.
Okay, let me start the slideshow.
Yes, we can see.
Great, that's the most important part. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to our colleagues in Warsaw. Well, my talk is going to be about urbanism and specifically about the urban form and structure of Warsaw and Kuala Lumpur. Two distinct cities, but as Shireen pointed out, there are some similarities. And first of all, urban structure is basically about the layout of the city, about the structural layout of the city and its major nodes, major landmarks, major sort of like connectors. And urban form is basically the 3D element all around. That means the buildings, the structures, and even the landscaping and the urban topography. So that is what is called urban form. And basically, first, I'm going to start with Kuala Lumpur, the evolution of Kuala Lumpur. I'll pick up where Mariana ended the story in 1957. And then I'm going to talk about the changing transformation of the city and the evolution of Warsaw. Basically, I think Kasia has highlighted very well the historical period. I'm going to talk about how did it influence on architecture and urbanism. And then there'll be in the conclusions, I'll have a comparison of the living standards in both cities. Well, basically, I'll start with Kuala Lumpur, and Kuala Lumpur now is well, people usually say that it is a city of 1.8 million, but that's a very wrong statement. Kuala Lumpur is a metropolitan area of 7.7 million. The 1.8 million is actually the area which is administered by the City Hall Kuala Lumpur, DBKL. And but apart from that, all the surrounding areas are very much interconnected. So it is called the KL Klang Valley or Greater KL or the Kuala Lumpur Metropolitan Region. And as I always point out, if anybody talks about Sydney or Melbourne, for instance, in Australia, they never talk about Sydney or having a population of 240,000 because this is the area of Sydney which is administered by Sydney City Council. They always talk of Sydney having a population 5.2 million. So I always highlighted to students that Kuala Lumpur is not 1.8 million, it's 7.7 million. And it includes all those, of course, the city of Kuala Lumpur with all those satellite and adjacent cities, including, of course, the main international airport, which is in Sepang. So the main access to Kuala Lumpur, international access is through Sepang, which is about 45 kilometers from the center of Kuala Lumpur. Now, if you look at the whole conurbation of Kuala Lumpur, it is pretty nuclear, polycentric. However, I would say Kuala Lumpur is still the main sort of like dominant center, but it has a strong competition in terms of other centers like Shalam, Subang Jaya, Kajang, and of course Putrajaya, which is a new administrative capital. Here you will see the rapid expansion of the city. This is how the city looked like in 1860s, the city that Mariana showed us, and it quickly expanded to a rather big city, a medium-sized city in the 1960s. But even at the eve of independence, Kuala Lumpur had a population of 300,000. It was still very much in the whole Malay Peninsula. It was very much overshadowed by Penang and Singapore. But as it became the capital, that's where really the city started to grow. And at the moment, I would say it sort of like resembles a typical post-industrial American city with the main sort of like central business district with the most amount of multinationals, which is central Kuala Lumpur, with a whole range of satellite cities, and of course all that connected by a whole network of highways. So it very much sort of like replicates an American city, and even a lot of scholars call Kuala Lumpur the Los Angeles of Southeast Asia. Now, picking up where Mariana ended the post-independence period, 1957, when Kuala Lumpur became the capital of Malaysia, the local authorities decided to build a whole network of new residential estates and even new townships like Petaling Jaya, and that was followed by Shalam and Subang Jaya. And one of their main aims was to balance the population of Kuala Lumpur, because Kuala Lumpur in 1957 was absolutely predominantly Chinese Malaysians. So actually being the capital of Malaysia, any capital should have at least 50 to 60% of the local population. So their aim was basically to bring the Malay population from the villages, from other areas of Malaysia to Kuala Lumpur and expand the city. And as I said, in terms of the cities, Petaling Jaya was the first sort of like city which was built, followed by Shalam and Subang Jaya. And if we look at the architecture of that period, it was basically very much sort of like influenced by the modernist ideas of the 1950s and 1960s, with a bit of reflecting the local tropical conditions. There was a lot of sort of like architecture which was resembling the regional tradition, like for instance, the National Mosque, Masjid Negara. And of course, that was when the first sort of like important infrastructure was built, the first airport. This is the first airport in Kuala Lumpur, Sungai Besi Airport, which was later changed to Subang Airport and later changed to the airport we have now, the Kuala Lumpur International Airport in Sepang. That was opened in 1990s. So we've got a little bit of mixture of modernist architecture in terms of urban form and a mixture of sort of like architecture depicting a lot of traditional elements. So that was sort of like the main sort of like architecture vocabulary of that period. Now, Kuala Lumpur, the whole metropolitan region expansion experienced a massive expansion under the leadership of Tun Mahathir, who was the prime minister of Malaysia between 1981 and 2003. And this was the time that the living standards of the citizens went up radically. This was the time that a lot of industries were sort of like introduced in Malaysia, like the car industry. And this was also the time of major mega projects in Kuala Lumpur Central, in Kuala Lumpur. And those mega projects included in educational establishments, health establishments, institutional establishments, and of course, other catalyst projects. One of the main pinnacle projects of that period was, of course, Kuala Lumpur Central City, KLCC, which sort of resembles the two Petronas Towers. And that was actually a very successful project because it replaced an old horse race track with a new office complex flanked by a beautiful park, which is today one of the most popular public spaces in Malaysia. And also that period also was the period when the Kuala Lumpur International Airport was constructed, which for years, for 10 years, I think was second or the third largest airport in Asia, and it's still one of the dominant airports in the whole Asian region. And of course, that was also the time of major events. Kuala Lumpur in 1998 was the host of the Commonwealth Games, and that triggered the development of the first public transport in the area. But if we look at the architecture vocabulary, it was a mixture of modernism and a mixture of a lot of influence of regional architecture, as you can see, for instance, on this example here. This is Istana Budaya, the main theater. You can see a lot of traditional elements being depicted here in this modern design. And this was also the time where, as I said, the living standards of people grew dramatically. So the car ownership has grown. So that was also the time where major highway construction within the agglomeration was initiated. And as a result, the major shopping malls that we know today were also initiated in that period between 1981 and 2003. So it was, I could say, a golden period for the whole region, because the region went from a pretty sleepy town still in the 1970s to a very thriving Asian agglomeration by the end of the 20th century. And of course, when I talk about that period, I should definitely mention about the building of the new administrative capital, Putrajaya. Putrajaya actually is located between the city center of Kuala Lumpur and the international airport, and that all became sort of like big, connection between the Kuala Lumpur International Airport, Putrajaya, Cyberjaya, and of course the Kuala Lumpur city center. And Cyberjaya is a planned city. It's planned around an artificial lake. It's sort of like still planned under the Orthodox planning school, so there's separation of uses. It was the plan for Putrajaya was developed in 1992. The city is still being built. It's close to a population of 100,000, and it's sort of like all the major ministries and all the major government institutions are located in Putrajaya. What didn't happen is that the diplomatic missions and the embassies did not follow. So actually the whole idea of making Putrajaya into a major capital of Malaysia didn't really work. So that's why we call it an administrative capital. And one of the mistakes that was made is when you look at the development of capital cities new capital cities around the world, you shouldn't develop them next to an existing capital city because it's very difficult for that city to compete. The diplomatic missions in Kuala Lumpur do not have to relocate to Putrajaya because it's only 20-25 minutes by car. So they can easily come and have all their meetings with the foreign ministries and interior ministries and all of that without relocating to Putrajaya. So in that sense, the development of Putrajaya hasn't expanded to the original plans, but the city is still growing and it's a very pleasant city to live. I live there, so I enjoy it very much. Okay, after the Mahavir era, there was the sort of like very strong aim to create Kuala Lumpur a global city so that Kuala Lumpur could be competitive with other cities in the region, basically with Singapore, with Bangkok, and with Hong Kong. And as a result of that, there was more catalyst projects in the city. One of the sort of like most famous recent catalyst project would be the River of Life project, which is sort of like the refurbishment of the old Gomba and Klang rivers in the city center. And this is an image of the first section of the River of Life in the evening that was completed a few years ago. And of course, there's a lot of new institutional and office buildings built in the center of Kuala Lumpur and in Putrajaya. And as you see, one of the sort of like typical architecture features is vertical landscaping. So vertical landscaping is becoming very popular. It's supposed to sort of like reflect the tropical climate of the city and in a way mitigate the sort of like thermal comfort around the built form. And there's of course a lot of new shopping centers that were developed in that period, and other ones is new master planned communities and townships. Sort of like the master planned communities and townships are being developed all over the Kuala Lumpur Metropolitan region. And unfortunately, one of their disadvantages is that they are still very much car dependent. Although Kuala Lumpur is developing a new, expanding its public transport system. And another thing that we should notice, element that we should notice in that period is a very strong expansion of private educational health institution. At the moment, if you look at the public universities in Kuala Lumpur, there's about 6-7 public universities and at almost 60 private universities and colleges. So the private education became a very strong international business for the city, and there's thousands and thousands of international students from all over the world studying in Kuala Lumpur. So it became a major sort of like institutional educational center. Now, apart from the big catalyst projects, there's of course some small scale projects like refurbishing the old parts of the city, and even an organization called Think City was established a few years ago, and their sort of like objective is to actually refurbish together with the users using the principles of tactical urbanism, so low-cost urbanism, to refurbish parts of the central city areas that went into a bit of decline with the development of the new shopping centers. And of course, it also, the other aim is to address traditional areas. For instance, Kampung Baru. Kampung Baru is located in the center of Kuala Lumpur. It was an old Malay village, which is now being overshadowed by high-rise on all sides. So the aim of the local authorities and the federal government is to actually protect as much of Kampung Baru, of this traditional Malay village, as possible. Now, I can't talk about Kuala Lumpur without talking about the ethnic diversity of the city. It is, I mean, I've seen a lot of cities around the world, and I must say that Kuala Lumpur is the most ethnically diverse city out of all the cities I've seen. And basically, since the 1960s, that diversity has actually expanded. It's actually expanded. And for instance, the Malay population has gone into very much into the traditional way of dressing, while as the Chinese population, they sort of like went for the globalized Western dressing styles. And it's also a very strong, although Malaysia is predominantly a Muslim country, it's a very diverse religious center. And it's not only the mosques, it's also the Hindu temples. The temples in Batu Caves, they actually trigger one of the biggest Hindu celebrations in the world. And when we were doing the analysis for central Kuala Lumpur, we couldn't believe how many cathedrals and Christian churches are located, especially in the central parts of the city. So a very diverse community, and the government actually is supporting all the time that diversity. For instance, the government is supporting vernacular schools where the Chinese Malaysians can actually study in their own language, their own customs, and that's all supported and paid by the government. And those are a few examples of Little India, brickfields, which is typical sort of like Indian enclave in Kuala Lumpur. And this is an example of Christmas decorations. One of my favorite sort of like activities is whenever I have any foreign visitors to Kuala Lumpur during Christmas time, I take them to the shopping center and I just watch their faces, how they're totally amazed when they see all the Christmas decorations, because this is something they would never expect in a predominantly Muslim country. So I would say very strong ethnic diversity and very strong religious diversity and religious tolerance. Now, in terms of the intentions for the future, well, Kuala Lumpur has developed a new plan, KL 2040 plan, which actually wants to bring the city one step forward, create a sustainable and smart city status. There's a few new infrastructure projects. One of the most dominant infrastructure projects is MRT2, the extension of the existing mass rapid transit. And of course, there is still the reach for the sky approach to build new high-rise towers, and the famous Petronas Towers, which were the tallest buildings in the world for 10 years, are being now overtaken by two new towers, Merdeka 118 and the Tun Razak Exchange. So the reach for the sky approach is still there. One of the biggest challenges, of course, for the local authorities is, and for the federal government, is actually to control the sprawl of the agglomeration. That's why all the time when I ever meet the local authorities or anybody from the planning department, I always tell them that the essential thing in the metropolitan area is to actually prepare a regional plan that would actually encompass the whole metropolitan region, and all the local plans done by the city of Kuala Lumpur, the city of Petaling Jaya would actually have to address the requirements of that regional plan. So that regional plan would inform the local plans. And I think that is absolutely critical for the agglomeration to stop, to actually halt this urban sprawl, which is, sprawling year from year. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges that the local authorities and the federal government has in terms of Kuala Lumpur. Now, Warsaw is, in terms of its urban structure, and that's the sort of like Warsaw in the 1930s, the sort of like the map show Kasia was showing, and that's the today's Warsaw with its agglomeration. Unlike Kuala Lumpur, Warsaw, of course, has an agglomeration population of 1.8 million and the metro area of 3.1 million. But unlike Kuala Lumpur, Warsaw is monocentric. It's not a polynuclear urban structure. Warsaw is definitely the main center of practically everything, and all the sort of like townships and towns around Warsaw are basically supporting towns. They're in no way in competition with Warsaw. So from a very much polynuclear urban structure that we see in Kuala Lumpur, with the slight dominance, still the slight dominance of the city of Kuala Lumpur, in Warsaw it's completely different. We see a very monocentric model where Warsaw is basically the main center and the main sort of like activity area. But as you see, one of the first similarities, if you can call that a similarity, is the population of the area administered by Warsaw City Council is 1.8 million, and the area administered by Kuala Lumpur City Council is also 1.8 million. Now, Warsaw in the 1930s was, and the 1920s and 1930s developed, I mean, the central parts developed pretty quickly. The Polish architects were very much influenced by the sort of like international modernists with Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier, very left-wing leaning. So there was a lot of new modernist residential projects sort of like built all around Warsaw. The center of Warsaw was very vibrant. People called it the Paris of the East. However, that was not really depicted in all of the city. And one of our famous writers, Mari Kozlowski, wrote a book about working class area, actually 30 minutes away from the center of that glitzy Warsaw, central Warsaw, where workers live in really terrible conditions. And that was, you know, a 360-degree, a total opposite what was happening 30 minutes away. And all the fringe areas of Warsaw basically look like this. So very poor areas, dilapidated, no infrastructure, no proper roads, very poor, underprivileged area. So Warsaw, yes, it was the Paris of the East in terms of the central part, but the outskirts of the city and some working class areas were really very much run down and dilapidated. So the city experience, it was a city of big contrasts. Now, after the war, as Kasia mentioned, the left bank of the city was totally destroyed. The right bank of the city was still remained intact, although there was still a lot of buildings being destroyed as a result of the war. And the communists, when they took power, their aim was to actually build a new city. And this was replicated in many countries, in Russia, in China. Once the communists took power, they wanted to demolish everything and build a new city, which has nothing to do with the old city. Luckily, through the intervention of the Polish architects, between 1949 and 1950, the old town of Warsaw, all of the old town of Warsaw was reconstructed to its original form, and now is, I would say, the most popular activity and tourist area in the city. And because, as I said, the communists really didn't want to recreate the old town, they just wanted to recreate one or two buildings and build something completely new. But anyway, as a result of the intervention of the Polish architects, Warsaw did not share the same fate as other cities like Kaliningrad or Minsk, which were totally built from the scratch to completely different cities. Now, quickly in the 1950s, the communists abolished the idea of modernism because they thought it wasn't really addressing their principles, and they initiated a new style called social realism, which was very much deriving from the classical styles, but sort of like depicting their power, because the communists were, of course, interested in sort of like displaying their power in art and architecture. This was their basic aim. And as a result of that, this is the new landmark of Warsaw, which still is today one of the major landmarks, the Palace of Culture and Science. which is right in the center of Warsaw, which was a present from the Soviet authorities to the Polish working classes. And this is built totally in this social realism style. After the death of Stalin, after 1950, late 1950s, early 1960s, social realism was abolished and it was replaced back with modernism, with pretty austere modernism. And then from the 1970s onwards, that was the era of the mass housing, prefabricated mass housing, which is flanking Warsaw from all the sides. So the new sort of like communist authorities were promoting the sort of like consumer socialism. So they built a new sort of like retail shopping center in the center of Warsaw, which exists until today. And of course, they were promoting the development of mass housing so that the population would be satisfied with having sufficient accommodation facilities. So that sort of like trend remained until 1989. 1989 was in some ways a very non-bloody, I would say, fall of the communist system and a gradual replacement of the free market economy. What Warsaw experienced in that period, 1989, 1990, was an explosion of free market everywhere. So people were trading on the streets, using their little cars to trade. And basically but then the existing residential stock was in very poor state. I think this image here replicates the state of that residential stock. I was sort of like fortunate enough to work in Warsaw during that time, 1990, 1991. And I remember in the 1980s reading a book by another of our famous writers, Tadeusz Konwicki, Little Apocalypse, where he depicted, envisaged an apocalyptic vision of Warsaw with ongoing demonstrations, buildings sort of like tumbling down because of poor quality structure, infrastructure breaking down. And this was a very high crime rate. And this was the Warsaw I experienced in the early 1990s. However, that gradually started to change. And I think 1992, 1993, the first new modern, I would say, shopping centers were being built. This is the shopping center, Panorama Shopping Center. I was actually fortunate enough to be involved in the design of that center. So gradually this sort of like chaos started to improve. And if we look at Warsaw 30 years later, it's a completely different environment. And as Ambassador Chitra mentioned, it is a pretty well-established city. It is definitely, it can be viewed as a capital, one of the capitals of the European Union. And basically, and there's no more chaos and street trading everywhere, and the crime rate has significantly decreased. So it became a pretty safe city. Now, in terms of the urban intervention projects, there's a lot of small-scale projects, sort of like extension of pedestrian sidewalks, building a whole new bicycle network. But the most famous ones is the promenade along the Vistula River, which in my view is one of the most successful riverfronts in the world because it's a low-cost riverfront. So it's something that's welcoming to all the sort of like members of the community. It's not one of those high-end waterfront projects. It is definitely a very, very prominent people's place. So a lot of urban intervention projects and definitely the development of the public transport, the metro line, And I think that events such as Euro 1212 definitely helped the city. But the major milestone was Poland joining the European Union in 2004. And I think that for Poland and any other European countries, that was Eastern European countries, that was the best thing that happened to them in the last few hundred years, that they were actually accepted to the European family. And that actually triggered a lot of projects and a lot of new urban intervention and architecture projects. In terms of architecture projects, there's another similarity with Kuala Lumpur, that Warsaw is also trying to reach for the sky. And for example, currently the Warsaw Tower is the tallest office tower in the European Union. It's almost completed, and the skyline of Warsaw has definitely changed dramatically in the past, I would say, decade, mainly with commercial office blocks. One of the sort of like unique, famous, sort of like iconic architecture, definitely the Poland Museum, which sort of like displays the Jewish sort of like minority group in history of the Jewish minority group in Poland from the 11th century until today. And this actually building won an EU award of the best building of the year. And also one of my favorite buildings, which I always want to take my students, I hope one day I will, my students from Malaysia, is the Warsaw Library. It's a fantastic building with a big, I wouldn't say a garden, but a park on the top of the building. So it's definitely one of the most prominent and unique buildings in the city. One of the other sort of like activity is urban regeneration and architecture conservation. And a lot of old factory buildings like this paper factory in Konstancin, or this wholesale market next to the Warsaw University of Technology, Hala Koszyki, are being refurbished for recreation, for leisure activities, cafes, shops, restaurants. And so that is definitely happening all over the city. All the 23 defensive forts that were built by the Russians in the 19th century are being now readapted into some other uses, mainly museums that are sort of like flanking the old sort of like defense line of Warsaw. And of course, last but not least, is the refurbishment of the old socialist residential stock. The upgrading of the landscaping around, and upgrading of the buildings. And it's done in a very simple way. All they do is basically render the building in more brighter colors, so they don't have this gloomy visual appearance like they had 20 years ago. This appearance is much better and much sort of like visually pleasing. So those are basically the major projects that are happening around the city. In terms of the Warsaw future projects, well, Warsaw has a very well-developed three-tier planning system. So there's a regional plan for the region of Mazowsze. The whole city has got a study of conditions and directions of spatial development. And all those two plans, one at the regional level and the other one at the city level, they actually inform the local plans. And the local plans are prepared all the time. At the moment, Warsaw has 200 local development plans for various parts of the city, and more of them are being prepared. And that actually allows for this massive urban intervention projects that are happening all over the city. Well, I think those urban intervention projects will still continue. This is one of the most prominent projects that is in line now, and that's the landscaping of the major street in Warsaw, Aleja Marszałkowska, which runs right through the city landscaping, with converting it into a typical urban boulevard. Now, if we look at the comparison of Warsaw and Kuala Lumpur, I've picked this sort of like those statistics from the Nambio site. You can actually compare the two cities, and they sort of like identified that criteria. So purchasing power, safety, health, climate, cost of living, property prices, pollution index as the criteria for quality of life. And basically, some elements are comparable, like if you look at the property price income, definitely Kuala Lumpur is more affordable than Warsaw. Warsaw is more expensive. In terms of the traffic index, well, Warsaw has still, unlike other Western European cities, Warsaw has still traffic jams and traffic problems. We've got public transport, but people are still sort of like linked to their cars, although the traffic jams are a bit less than in Kuala Lumpur. In terms of the pollution, unfortunately, Polish cities are quite polluted. So the level of pollution is not close to Western European cities. It's sort of like comparable to Kuala Lumpur. In terms of the health, well, definitely Kuala Lumpur is better, and living here and there, I can agree with that, because Kuala Lumpur has a whole network and Malaysian cities of private healthcare clinics and hospitals, which Polish cities and Warsaw still don't have. They do, but not to this extent. In terms of safety index, this is a bit surprising, because I don't feel that Warsaw is that much safer than Kuala Lumpur, and in some ways I don't find Kuala Lumpur unsafe. But as I said, I live in Putrajaya, so I can't sort of like speak for Kuala Lumpur. I'm not there on daily basis, but I think it's because of petty crime that Kuala Lumpur seems to be not scoring high on the safety list. But if we conclude everything in terms of the quality of living index, Warsaw is a little bit more ahead, but not that much. I think that these cities are quite comparable, and as I said, there's some things that are better in developed in Kuala Lumpur, and some things that are better developed in Warsaw. Now I want to finish this whole conclusions by those two images depicting the most charming weather patterns in both cities. Actually, Warsaw, if you're ever in Warsaw, the sunset along the Vistula River are really charming, with the new silhouette of the city skyline in the background. And in Kuala Lumpur, if you're ever visiting Kuala Lumpur, your friends from Warsaw, during a thunderstorm, go up on one of the high-rise towers and observe the thunderstorms. It's a fantastic experience. And actually, Kuala Lumpur is #1 capital in the world in terms of the number of thunderstorms. It's got more thunderstorms than any other capital city in the world. So that is something that should be observed. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mari. It was a very interesting share between the two cities. But I just want to tell the audience that, Mari, I was telling you before that many of Malaysians, they do not know that in Poland, they use the currency is zloty instead of a euro, because many Malaysians still think that in Poland they're using euro. So from my experience, I would share with our Malaysian friends that is very affordable when we are in Poland, because the exchange is about the same, right?
It's 1-to-1, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So with that, thank you very much, Dr. Mari. And we now open the floor to the audience. If you have any questions to any of the presenters, and please state your name, and don't forget to unmute. Okay. Do you have any questions from the audience? All right. Just now, I think in our audience, we have Mr. Fauzi from Switzerland. I think he messaged that he has a question to the presenter. So, Mr. Fauzi.
Hello, hi, good evening, everybody, and yeah, good morning from here. Dr. Mari, I'm interested. Thank you very much for your presentation. I actually have been very lucky because I travel to Poland very often as part of my job. And then, one thing that I noticed was actually I really like the design of the new train station. I mean, that's one thing. So this is something that related to presentation and also Dr. Mari. I think that some of the train station, they actually use the location of the existing historical and also very nice old architecture building. So this is something I saw, for example, in Krakow and in Poznan. I think they have a very nice new modern train station as part of the urban development supported by the EU, I believe. My question is that, I mean, how do the country wanted to preserve the old architecture design while at the same time they are actually modernize the country? And this is also one thing that I saw actually, that even in front of the Culture Palace, because they are building now the new Museum of Modern Arts. So I mean, I like the area so much, but then I think in the next 2 or 3 years, with the new Museum of Modern Art, that it has been designed to match to take into consideration the cultural parts of the area. But how do, I mean, can you comment just a bit about the initiative to preserve the old historical values, architecture, buildings, and so on? Thank you, Dr. Mari.
Oh, well, I think in that case, Poland has quite a long history. And I mean, after the Second World War, when the communists took power, they, as I said, they were not interested in, because apart from Krakow, most of the cities like Gdansk, Wrocław, Poznań, they were all destroyed. Not as badly as Warsaw, but they were. And the communists were not interested in actually preserving any old urban fabric. Okay, 1 or 2 buildings, yes, maybe 1 cathedral, and that's it. They wanted, their ideology was to create something new. But I think that the group of Polish architects really insisted that the historical areas in the city be preserved. And this is what happened to Wrocław, Gdańsk, and of course to Warsaw. So it sort of like has a long history. And then preservation of historic buildings was always on the top agenda. When I was studying architecture, late 70s, 1980s, that was my subject for 4 years. I mean, I was studying architecture, but preservation of historic buildings was a subject that I was taught from year 2 to year 5. And yeah, I remember the old town of Krakow was one of the first areas in Europe to be fully pedestrianized, and that happened in the late 1970s. So that sort of like tradition continued until today. And today, actually, in most of the Polish cities, like for instance, in my city in Krakow, it's almost impossible to demolish a building which is old, but just because this building is an industrial building or a disused building, you have to revamp it and reconstruct it and utilize it to new function, but you cannot demolish it. And I think this is this sort of like tradition on, and with the sort of like strong planning legislation, which actually imposes on you to retain all the industrial buildings, is a result of why many old stations are not demolished but sort of like continued as part of the railway stations. So I think this is the reason. First reason is the tradition, which sort of like goes from the Second World War, and the second one is the very strong planning legislation, which actually enforce developers and architects to retain whatever they can. And Warsaw is, of course, more liberal in terms of what you can build than Krakow or Gdańsk. There's no way, it's a pretty liberal city. I mean, if you look at the skyline, but even in Warsaw, it's practically impossible to demolish an old building now. Just because
Actually, I was in Krakow. You see the background behind me is the arch in Krakow, your city.
Yes,
Mari.
I see that. Yeah, very much. Yeah.
Okay, thank you
at
very
the train
much.
station. The new one is just next to it. Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Mr.
Dr.
Fauzi.
Mari.
Yeah, maybe we can, due to the time, maybe we can open for another questions if there are any to the other presenters. Okay, with that, I think we can move on to the last session, which is the closing remarks by Dr. Jaroslaw Suchopoulos. Yeah, I think we met before in Serdang at a Mama Eatery, if you still remember. All right. Before that, let me read your biography. Dr. Jaroslaw Suchopoulos was a former ambassador of Poland in Finland. Currently, Dr. Suchopoulos is a senior research fellow at the Department of Music, Art and Culture Studies of the University of Jyväskylä, Finland. He is involved in a variety of projects on the history of memory of World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Helsinki in 2000. Between 2000 and 2001, he was an analyst of the Polish Institute of International Affairs in Warsaw, Poland. Between 2001 and 2013, he lectured in a few universities in the United States, Poland, and Germany. In 2013 and 2015, he was an associate professor at the University of Malaysia of International Affairs of IKMAS at the University Kebangsaan Malaysia. In 2017, he returned to Finland, and this time as an ambassador of Poland. With that, I would like to call Dr. Jaroslaw Suchopoulos to give your closing remarks.
Thank you very much for your kind presentation. Salam alaikum, selamat datang. When you introduced my friend Mari Kozlowski, who is the spiritus movens of this seminar, and as far as I know, the main organizer, Marek, thank you very much for organizing this event and for your kind invitation extended to me. You were trying to force Dr. Marek to say something about similarities between Warsaw and Kuala Lumpur. But Dr. Marek rather was speaking about differences than similarities, which is quite obvious because we are speaking about cities from, let us say for our working purposes, from different planets. And I would like only to remind one of my first experiences in Kuala Lumpur. In fact, my first short in Kuala Lumpur took place in 1997, almost 25 years ago. And from that time, I remember when I visited with my wife Batu Caves. It was a very different place than it is today. Batu Caves at that time was a place located somewhere in the far suburbs of Kuala Lumpur, not very commonly even visited. I remember there were maybe 4 or 5 people in caves, and when I visited the place 20 years later, or almost 20 years later in 2015, I was able to use a train to go there. Crowd was flowing in and out, so it was a very different place. And my other experience in Kuala Lumpur in 2015, when I visited Mid Valley shopping mall, I had an impression. I visited a bar from Star Wars, where all possible, creators from all possible planets were represented, and this diversity was simply something which, at that time and also today, nobody could expect in Warsaw. So the first thing which I want to stress, summing up this what honorable speakers were touching during their presentations, is that historical development of these two cities is very different. Even if we speak about such major events in 20th century in history of Kuala Lumpur, like the fire from 1881 or the flood from 1926, we were still speaking about a small village or later relative city in comparison to Warsaw from the same time. Warsaw was already at the turn of 19th and 20th century a big metropolis of about 1 million people. The other thing is that geographical conditions influence strongly the situation of both cities. Kuala Lumpur, the very name of the city, means the confluence of rivers, and the proximity of the sea is also a very important factor influencing its structure, so to say. Warsaw was a kind of city which was a political center from, so to say, immemorial times. So it was already a relatively big city in 14th, 15th, 16th century. Of course, when we speak about conditions from these times. Of course, the question which is a very important thing is that historical experience in recent 100 years for Kuala Lumpur is a city which is constantly developing itself with many changes, with better periods, but the city is constantly developing. And Warsaw experienced the moment when it was largely destroyed, although I do not agree with you, Marek. Gdańsk was destroyed even worse than Warsaw during the war. But this is just a remark without big significance. What I want to say is that Warsaw experienced some tragic years in its history. But on the other hand, when we look at the problem from purely architectural point of view, we could say that after the war, after 1945, architects and urban planners obtained a very rare opportunity. They obtained this destroyed city, which means that they obtained the place, fully serviced place. Of course, these services like sewages, like gas lines, gas pipelines, electric lines were also destroyed, but they still existed. And after the war, Polish architects, it is possible to say that objectively could obtain a big chance to convert the city immediately in something very special, for example, like a garden city or something like this. But political reasons did not allow them to do it. Communism, which Poland together with the Soviet army in 1944, 1945, made it impossible because some ideological considerations were much more important. And it was the reason why so-called social realism was more important than any other considerations. This is what Dr. Marek was speaking, for example, about the possible fate of the old city in Warsaw is very important. I think we should here mention at least the name of Professor Jan Zachwatowicz, who in fact defended somehow the idea that the old city should be rebuilt. And I hope this how he and his people, his staff, how they were trying to mark even the shapes of these houses in the old city destroyed during the war. Anyway, if we look for some similarities, I would say that an important thing in the 19th and 20th century is that for many, many years and decades, both cities were colonial cities, in fact. I mean, of course, the situation of Warsaw was different. It was still a big city, the biggest city of Poland, but it was still ruled by foreign rulers. Of course, Kuala Lumpur could not be compared on the turn of 19th and 20th century with Warsaw, because it was a small city which was created because of very different reasons. It was a village and later the town and finally city, which was the center of tin trade and rubber trade, tin mining, etc., etc., etc. But still, the freedom of the development, I mean, in the sense that the local people could take care for the development of their own future, was rather limited. A big difference between both cities is this what I partly wrote in a book blurb. Marek, I am not trying to flatter you, but the book which you wrote together with Krzysiek Nawratek and one of your Malaysian colleague, Asma Mehan, is really very fascinating, and I was really very privileged to write something about this book. And if I may, I would like to mention one or two sentences from this which I wrote about Kuala Lumpur, because here we also can see the big difference between Warsaw and Kuala Lumpur. So what I wrote there, that Kuala Lumpur was or is a multi-ethnic microcosm of city microcosm, one of the most important urban centers in Southeast Asia. And the theoretical approach of authors towards problems they discuss is combined with presentation of KL's history and complicated multi-dimensional religious, social, and political structure of the place, which is the heart of today's Malaysia. And here we can also see this difference, because Warsaw is still not a microcosm or melting pot of many cultures, many religions. Of course, the number of expats is increasing, but this is not one of main features of the place. What else I want to say? 1980s, 1990s, and today, because I also don't want to abuse your time. It seems to me that Kuala Lumpur, as a modern metropolis, could start to exist a little earlier than Warsaw because of political reasons. We can today say many good or bad things about rules of Prime Minister Mahathir, whom I must say I admire more and more with elapsing time. Also because of the fact that during the second period of his premiership, he was able also to admit that he also made some mistakes. Only really great statesmen can do this. I made a mistake. We should repair this and that. Also in the sense of social development of the country and the city Kuala Lumpur. So when Mahathir came to power, he was able, in the national interest, whatever he thought about this and whatever we can speak about it, to begin these big projects which convert Kuala Lumpur from a quiet city somewhere in Southeast Asia into a big metropolis. I remember when I came for the first time with my wife in 1997, to me, it was like a travel to a very different planet. You know, oh, wow, something like this. And we in Poland, we could begin these big projects, even not immediately, only after the collapse of communism at the turn of 1980s and 1990s, because we had to also accumulate capital, we had to make plans, we had to overcome this chaos which Dr. Marek was absolutely correctly mentioned and described for your sake, in my opinion, very well. So I agree also with you, Marek, that only after our joining of the European Union, we could really use the chance offered by, especially by obtaining external funds. And today, I agree that both cities develop, of course, in different manner, which is conditioned by local conditions, but in some sense, it seems to me that elapsing time make these cities more and more similar to each other. That elapsing time, and in which I mean that we can, in both cities, we can still develop big projects. We can think about the future, some perspectives, 2040, 2050, etc. And we can also think about this, how to convert both cities in so-called smart cities. But this is, of course, the matter of the future. And I'm still not quite convinced in which direction all this idea about smart city 1.0 or 2.0, 3.0, all these theoretical considerations, in which direction we are going. Because on the one hand, when we stay just at the level of theoretical considerations, it seems that the idea of smart city is something which should improve the quality of life of inhabitants, and also the quality of their education, because we must talk about this involvement of inhabitants in the ideas of city, and it requires their proper education. But when we look at this, for example, what is going on in Chinese cities? What is the level of surveillance over inhabitants? What authorities are really thinking about the idea of smart city? I am a little bit skeptical, but also I remain with my hope that Warsaw and Kuala Lumpur will offer in the future the highest possible level of services to inhabitants, and that these cities, people who live there, will be happy that they live there. So I think that we are still a couple of minutes behind our schedule. I think that I will stay with this, what I already said. Anyway, during this seminar, we were trying to compare something incomparable, but the fact that both cities, it is difficult to compare both cities, is also a lesson. We can teach from each other somehow, and this what is applicable, we can try to use to teach from each other and use in our cities. So I think this is everything which I wanted to say. Thank you very much. Terima kasih. And once more again, Marek, thank you very much for this kind invitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jaroslaw. Jarek, sorry. I would like to, what I can see is that we might have another session in the future with you, because your understanding, the way your take on Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, I think is fantastic. Thank you very much for the closing remark. With that, I think we come to an end of our session. So my gratitude goes to the presenters, to all the presenters. It was a fantastic sharing session. Thank you very much to all. And but most of all, I would like to thank our audience who has been with us for the past 2.5 hours. We hope that we could see you again in future. And I would like to say thank you, terima kasih, dziękuję, and till we meet again. So thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
My
Bye.
pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very
Okay.
much. Thanks.
Thank you.